welcome to one of the final sessions of our One Homes Week this week. And today we have Jade Monroe from NUS, who is going to be focusing on hidden energy poverty, the student perspective. If you do have any questions throughout the session, please put them in the group chat box and I will read them out at the end, or you're invited to join in a discussion. Thank you. Over to you, Jade.
Perfect, thanks Alice. So hopefully everyone can now see my screen. Okay, so hi, my name is Jade and I am a Senior Project Manager at the National Union of Students in the Sustainability Department. So today I'm here to talk about the hidden energy poverty and taking that from a student perspective, and this is focusing on HE and some FE, so mostly university students. So firstly, I'll start off by talking about the student energy poverty experience and some research that we've done on that. So at the moment, there currently isn't really any accurate measure as to how many students are in energy poverty. And I'll come to kind of some of the reasons for that later on in the discussion. But what we have been doing at NUS is some research. So we've got our Homes Fit for Study research, and we've done 3 rounds of this now, which doesn't necessarily pinpoint how many students are in energy poverty, but it does feed back some of the experiences that students are feeling. So we know that many students are reporting that they feel uncomfortably cold, they struggle to pay their energy bills, and they experience negative health impacts as a result of their accommodation. Looking at that research a little bit further, there's loads of it and loads of stats in there, but I've pulled out a few of the key parts. And firstly, it's that many students are reporting that they do live in poor quality accommodation. So you can see here that 2/3 of students have experienced conditions such as condensation, drafts, damp and mould, and there's a whole host of other issues that they're reporting that they also experience in their accommodation. We have many students letting us know that they are feeling cold in their accommodation as well. So the stats show that around 46% have at some point felt uncomfortably cold, and over 70% are saying that they often limit how much they put their heating on as a way to save money. Next, we'll look at their energy bills. So again, we know that lots of students can have some struggles when paying their bills. So the stats here show how students pay their rent and also how they pay their energy bills. And it's around 45% that are saying that they're struggling either on a regular basis or occasionally to pay energy bills. And what I get quite surprised at is just how much proportion of students' income goes on housing and accommodation. So here there's a pie chart that shows that 89% spend half or more of their income every month on just on housing. And this has all led to students having some really negative impacts for them in their accommodation. So over 1/3 are reporting impacts on their mental health, so feeling miserable, feeling anxious and depressed. And we're also having students telling us that it's making health conditions worse or bringing on new health conditions as well. And part of the research that we did was also about trying to get the student voice and really capturing some of their experiences. So lots of the things that we fed back on, and this definitely tallies with my experience of speaking to students, is the 2 real main things that students experience are cold and then damp and mould as well. So we've got issues here with students that have cold, damp, mould homes that impact on their health. We have lots of students reporting how cold their conditions are. So here we've got someone whose room on average is around 10 degrees C. We had students tell us about having ice on their beds and in their duvets because it's so cold in their room. And also just that students can feel quite disempowered sometimes to know what they can do about it. So here we've got a student who's been trying to put bubble wrap on their window in kind of a desperate attempt to make their room warmer, but their landlord wasn't up for that. So they've then had to take that down and they're still living in those cold conditions. So as a kind of a recap from the research that we've been doing over those good number of years now, is that whilst there's kind of no statistics at the moment that can conclusively say how many students are in energy poverty, we really know that the experiences that students are feeding back to us are demonstrating characteristics that they are living in energy poverty. And that is things like poor quality accommodation, feeling uncomfortably cold, spending large proportions of their income on housing and bills, and also experiencing negative impacts on their health and well-being. So now I'll take a look at some of the vulnerability factors as to why we think students are more vulnerable to energy poverty. So firstly, I think one of the key things is experience. So for many young people and students, it will be their first experience of renting and paying bills. And it could be incredibly difficult to navigate the energy market and know what to do and know how to deal with issues and problems. So we have lots of students feeding back to us that they just don't know their rights as a tenant. So they don't know if they are able to change their suppliers or energy tariffs. And they don't know how to request things. They don't really know what they're able to influence within their properties. There's also many that are really unsure of their energy costs and budgeting. So if they've had no experience of paying bills in the past, they just don't have a benchmark as to know what to expect to put aside for energy bills. So we can see here we've got a student that their energy supplier said that it'd be around £30 a month for their energy, and actually it turned out to be triple that. And we see that a lot. We see students who think that they've budgeted the right amount and actually their energy bills are incredibly high and they just can't afford to pay them. And we also have the students that don't have experience of so many of the kind of the practical things as well. So many of our students say that they don't know how to control their heating or program their heating or even know how to kind of go about starting that, or that they can even control their heating. Some students don't realise that that is something that's within their control. They don't know how to manage their bills. They don't know how to manage how to address when issues arise. So if they get into arrears, it can be really daunting as to know how to progress on that. And also just communicating with landlords. So if there is a problem, often students won't let their landlord know. They'll just put up with it, and they don't realise what is within their responsibility and what's within the landlord's responsibility. One of the other vulnerability factors is the large households. So we know that there's lots of large households that students live in that have many shared responsibilities, and also the differences of abilities to pay within those households too. So we've got a quote here about having arguments over heating levels, with some people really struggling to pay for the heating, whereas others that have a larger income and wanting to have the heating on more. We know that there's, again, many issues with splitting bills. So often that can be in one student's name and they're then responsible to having to pay for the consumption of others in their property. And that can put on huge strain, especially if some of your flatmates who you may not even know very well are just not giving you that money and not getting you into your overdraft, and you then get into financial problems when it's out of your control. And I also think that there can be lots of inefficiencies within the home when responsibilities aren't clear. So if you've got a large household, it can always feel like it's somebody else's responsibility to switch off the light or to program the heating, or everyone wants the light switched on so you don't do anything about it. So again, that can really kind of add to wastage of energy within a property. Again, another vulnerability factor is housing affordability and just the competition of it. So in student areas, there can be huge competition for student housing. We know that students start looking for accommodation typically in around sort of September, October time. So they literally arrive at university and then look for their accommodation for the next year, and it can be very competitive. And because students have such low incomes, we know that the main factor for them is they just need to know that they can pay their rent, that their student loan and that their extra part-time work will be able to cover the cost of that rent. So without a doubt, the main priority when choosing accommodation is cost of rent, rather than thinking about an efficient property. And then finally, my last kind of student vulnerability factor is the public perception. And without a doubt, this is the one that frustrates me more than anything. And that is the view that it is a rite of passage for students to live in poor quality accommodation. So firstly, I just do not subscribe to living in conditions that impact on your health and your well-being being kind of character building. Like, I don't think that should be a thing. But I guess I realised that this kind of view of rite of passage has potentially arisen from studies many years ago, when the proportion of university students were potentially those from a more privileged background who lived in privileged surroundings, and then they went to university as this kind of character building experience. experience. I still don't think that that's a great thing, but I think that's where that view has arisen. But now the student demographics have just changed. That isn't the case anymore. We have students that have always lived in a cold home and then come to university and also live in a cold home. We have students who are carers, who are parents, who have health conditions, who have disabilities, international students. Like, that character building kind of case isn't applicable anymore. So I think it's really damaging to still have that view that it's okay for students to have a couple of years of living in really terrible conditions. And I think that can really block people wanting to take more action and listen to student voices as well. So going back to the question of why it's difficult to measure energy poverty within students. So our research kind of shows that it does demonstrate that students are vulnerable, they have low incomes, they have high costs, poor quality housing, all the factors for energy poverty. But it's really hard to measure that. So firstly, students don't really qualify for assistance schemes. So many of the things that can identify that somebody is suffering from energy poverty, such as welfare, help and benefits, students often don't qualify for those. You also have the transient population. Many students will live in different properties and only stay in them for a year. And then there's the differences in income within households. So again, this is something that we find a lot, that you may have a student in one room that is in very cold conditions and is really struggling to pay their energy bills and getting into huge financial issues with that. And yet somebody living down the corridor for them in the same property is always got their electric heater on, which is hugely inefficient, racking up huge bills, and they can afford to pay that. So often there can be differences within that household when someone is experiencing characteristics of energy poverty and another student isn't. And I think those difficulties has meant and resulted in an issue where students are just often not considered within energy poverty discussions. They're not included and they're not really helped with energy poverty. There's not much help or assistance out there to get them out of what can be really tough situations. And that leads on to the fact that actually not all students are impacted equally. So I think it's fair to say that there's some probable factors that make some students more vulnerable to energy poverty than others. And the most obvious one is probably the amount of family financial support that they get. But I think that there will be a whole host of other factors that impact student energy poverty, but there just hasn't been any research that kind of has looked at identifying them. But more recently, we have done a small research project that looks at the impact of gender on energy poverty. And for me, this wasn't necessarily the most obvious group to look at that might be disproportionately affected. But when we surveyed students across 7 EU countries, we found some really kind of clear findings. And I've framed this more as the gender warmth gap. So there's loads of information on here, but I've tried to pick out the key points to demonstrate. So firstly, it's that those who are identifying as women are more likely to live in poor quality accommodation. So here we've got 44% of women compared to 31% of men live in properties that experience damp and mould. And again, 38% of women here compared to 21% of men lived in properties with drafts. And these are just a few stats. We found this kind of across the board, that women were reporting that they lived in worse and more poor quality accommodation than men were reporting. We can also see that those identifying as women are more likely to take energy saving actions. So 28% of women compared to 35% of men take absolutely no actions at all. So there's many more men that aren't doing anything to try and save energy and costs within their accommodation. And again, women are more likely to feel cold. So 33% of those who identify as women compared to 43% of men have a thermal comfort that's about right. So you're much more likely to have a good thermal comfort if you're a man compared to a woman. So our findings were really clear, and it wasn't necessarily what we expected, that those identifying as women are much more vulnerable to energy poverty than those identifying as men. So more women were reporting that they lived in substandard properties, that they felt cold, that they take more actions to reduce their energy, and that they have more negative impacts on their health and well-being. And this then links to the fact that energy poverty could have much wider impacts and consequences. So here we're going to look at student health, attainment and and dropout. So, as we've talked about before, students are often not considered, included, or helped with energy poverty. And I think some of that is because there is a view that energy poverty is just a temporary problem, as students often move into better accommodation once they have graduated. And in many respects, I'm kind of really pleased to say that I probably agree with that view, that I think for many students, they do have a greater ability to get out of energy poverty compared to some of the other vulnerable groups, which is a really fantastic thing. However, the question I kind of always ask myself is, does student energy poverty have a hidden consequence? So is it more than just feeling really bad for a couple of years in your accommodation? Does it contribute to much more wider social inequality? And the things that make me think about this are that research that NUS has done shows that dropout rates are highest among students from working class backgrounds, and also a third of part-time students and over 10% of Black students leave their course before the second year of study. Research has also shown that within universities there's a problem with a disabled student attainment gap and a Black student attainment gap as well. So again, I asked the question of, like, does energy poverty and the detrimental impacts on health, mental health, finances contribute to student dropout and attainment for some students more than it does for others? In my opinion, that probably is the case. At the moment, there hasn't been any research that has been done that links that all together. But I would say that if the answer is yes, that student energy poverty can impact students and also their families, not only just for those couple of years that they are studying and living in that poor quality accommodation, but it can really impact their life going forward if they're not attaining the same as their peers, or they're dropping out of their course. And this has the real ability to contribute to wider social inequality. And we do know that from the research, students report that it does have an impact on their academic work. So we have a student here who has 2 overdrafts, 2 credit cards, work 14-hour shifts, and they still struggle to pay their bills. And it can be really hard to find the time to study if you're working that much and have that kind of financial pressure. And we also have students who say that they can't work at their homes because how they'd like to, because they're just too cold. So it can really impact their productivity and their ability to work and study as well. So the kind of the picture at the moment is a bit depressing, maybe, and I'm sure many people that work within the energy poverty arena can feel quite depressed at the stories that they hear, and it can be really upsetting to know the conditions that people live in. But we are trying to do some things to address that, and it's not the full kind of approach to getting some things and positive things happening, but at least it's something to try and get some positive change for students. So firstly, we are trying to engage, inform and empower students to improve their energy efficiency. So as I was saying before, you don't go to university and have a lecture on how to navigate energy suppliers or how to save energy or what kind of bills you have. So we really want to try and give students that information. And we think about the theory of the moment of change. So that's when students are going through a huge change in their life, and that's often moving out from home for the first time, going and living away from their parents or their carers and their family, and that's when new habits and behaviours are formed. And unfortunately for students, the majority of them go into halls of residences where they have absolutely no reason to think about energy efficiency because all of their bills are included. So that first moment of change can be really inefficient. So what we try to do is use our position as the National Union of Students to try and have that trusted source of information for students, where we can give out information and also empower them to make some positive changes. So at the moment, we've got 2 main campaigns that we do run this through. We have the Student Switch Off campaign and then Student Switch Off Plus. So Student Switch Off is our halls of residence energy saving competition. And this is a really great way to just impart those really basic energy saving behaviours for students. So this is focusing on the simple stuff, such as switching off your lights, turning off appliances, cooking efficiently. But what our research has shown that is if you can get students doing that in their halls of residences, they do take that forward with them once they move into the private rented sector. So we do lots of really fun things with them. We do lots of competitions, loads of quizzes, there's prizes. They have an overall hall competition where they win a prize for the best hall. But it's all about just giving them an incentive to be efficient and raising that awareness just all the time across the year. And we really utilise peer-to-peer support. So we get lots of volunteers on board to then go and talk to people within their flat and influence them and have those conversations. So it's a really effective campaign for delivering that initial kind of energy literacy when they're first moving into accommodation. And then we complement that through Student Switch Off Plus, which then goes from being energy efficient to being more energy smart. So it's about then supporting students on that move from halls of residences into private accommodation, or those that have just come from home and then gone straight into private accommodation as well. And we'll do things like looking at telling students about energy performance certificates, letting them know what an energy bill looks like and how much their energy is typically should be costing them, telling them that they can change their suppliers and all of the things that they can be doing within their property to make them feel warmer, make them feel more comfortable, and also try and help them to save some money as well. So through those two campaigns, we run them in the UK in around 20 universities this year, and we also run it in 7 EU countries as well. So we've got loads of universities on board, and if you add all of that together, you do have thousands of students that we communicate with every year, that we're trying to give that real basis for them of supporting them in that moment of change and going into private accommodation. So that's everything from me in terms of what we do and the research that we've done. And how much time have we got? We've probably got a good 10 minutes maybe to take some questions if there's any out there. So I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks, Jade. That was really useful and insightful. We've got quite a lot of questions in the group chat. So what we could do is, if I read your name out, you can come forward and ask your question if you like. Is that okay, Jade, if we go through that way?
Yeah, great.
So we have one from Rebecca Jones, who states, students rarely fall into the usual energy industry vulnerability criteria. How can we support them going forward? I still remember living in a cold home as a student 25 years ago, like it was yesterday.
Yeah, it's really hard to know how to support students, because definitely there are things that are within their control. So they, the things that we tell them to do, it is about closing your curtains, having draft excluders, having LED light bulbs, programming your heating. But I think so much of it falls within the landlord remit. So the core issue with students having a lot of the problems that they do experience, it is just that they live in really poor quality accommodation. And we find that really hard to know how to address that, because that is that's landlords that need to improve their housing stock. And when they have a captive market of students, there's not always that much incentive to want to do that. In terms of energy suppliers, I think considering students when they are setting up their accounts. So we have students reporting that it took them ages to get their account set up because there were students before that hadn't paid their bills. I think the issue with students having one student being responsible for the whole household is a real problem. And I know that some companies have sprang up in terms of offering bill splitting options. So that's when all the students register and it's more down to individual students rather than just one. But the issue that we found with that is that those bill splitting companies can have really expensive tariffs, and like hugely expensive tariffs. So whilst it kind of lessens the responsibility on one student, it does really increase costs as well. So anything that can be done to support those students when they are setting up their accounts and helping them, guide them through that process of managing bills with loads of different householders, that would be really beneficial.
Thank you. Helen Stanton has got a good question around the gender difference. Helen, do you want to ask? I don't know where you are. She asks, did you gather any insights that shed light on what these behaviours were and whether they were positive actions? So in terms of taking action to reduce energy, was there a gender difference?
Yeah, so the actions that I showed on the slide, and apologies, there was so much info on there, it was really hard to see it. But the types of actions that was more likely to see women taking than men were things like turning their heating down, turning the heating off, switching off lights. There was washing their clothes less frequently, using less water. So the kind of the core energy saving actions were the things that we were measuring, and pretty much across the board, it was more likely that a woman was to take these actions compared to men.
Great. We've got a lot of questions around landlords specifically and whether NUS have done any work with landlords, and is there any pressure being put on landlords to help students specifically?
Yeah, so we have done some work with landlords. Often the landlord work goes into individual student unions. So those student unions within each university will then work with their landlords, and they all have different approaches to it. So some will have approved landlord schemes, others will have confidential hotlines that students can call up the hotline and report problems, and they can be guided through how to then navigate issues with their landlords. We've definitely found that landlords are the harder group to engage with. Like, our strength is engaging with students, and we know that we do that well, and we always struggle to know how to effectively engage with landlords. And we've tried a few different methods. So we have some kind of behaviour change campaigns that we run with staff members and we run with students as well. And we've tried to kind of pilot those with landlords, and there is enthusiasm, but also actually getting real change happening. And especially when there is a big financial implication for landlords to be making those changes as well, has been something that we've struggled with. But we know that on a more local level, the student unions do a really good job of being that intermediary kind of body between students and the landlords.
Yeah, I agree, and I think there's so many landlords popping up that now offer student accommodation that are private and not linked to universities specifically, that they will get harder and harder to reach, like you say.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, we've got so many just going through. We had a good one. Were there any geographical differences in the issues that you were talking about? More problems paying bills in certain areas of the country. So was that quite clear, or was it quite a mixed bag?
So that's not something that we've ever looked in. Our research focused on different countries, so we did that across 7 EU countries. But in terms of breaking down the Homes Fit for Study research by area, I don't think that was done. So I don't have any information to be able to feedback on that.
Okay. Let's have a look. Does anybody want to say their question out loud? Please just unmute yourselves if you don't mind. Oh, here's one. How do your campaigns fit into National Student Money Week? Do universities or student unions have field poverty officers, specialists? Has that cropped up anywhere?
Yeah, so most of our student unions have kind of focused weeks throughout the year on different issues. So I've definitely been invited to a few student money weeks, and they have their accommodation departments, there's university kind of welfare departments that will run stalls and events to get students engaged within that. In terms of field poverty officers, that's not something that I know of that any student union has that in particular, but they do have things like welfare officers, they have housing officers and accommodation officers. They often have community officers as well, so people that will work to kind of bridge that gap between the student unions and the local community as well. It's definitely something that unions work on, but I guess for housing, there's so many housing issues that crop up. So things from getting the accommodation, safety, infestations, deposits. I do sometimes think that energy gets a little bit lost in that, but I don't think that's in particular. I think it's just that there's so much to cover for young people who are experiencing all of these different issues for the first time.
Yeah, I agree. As well, just going back to like universities and landlords, obviously NUS working closely with students' unions, they're often able to help students directly that way. But do you find that universities are quite proactive in also taking action with landlords, or do they leave it up to a student union?
It can be really varied. And there's just no real rule of thumb. So you can have some student unions that work incredibly hard on housing, and that is within the union's remit. And other university settings you have, it's very much embedded within the university department rather than the SU. Right. So yeah, I don't think there's any kind of clear way of going about it. It can be very different.
Okay. Anybody got a question that they'd like to ask?
Am I allowed to jump in, Alice?
Yeah, of course, Bryony.
Bryony Holroyd from NEA. I think a couple of people have asked similar questions as well. Is the NUS doing anything to kind of put pressure on either the NUS themselves, the local NUS branch, or the university or the local council to regulate, have a regulated list of private sector landlords? Because I know I went to Manchester University, and I think the council was starting to have an accredited list. And if you can get them to do checks like an EPC and check all the heating systems working and that sort of thing, that can help reduce the really poor quality ones at the outset.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I think it's one of these things that is very variable across different cities and different universities as well. So some universities do have loads of work working very closely with their councils and having those approved supplier lists or approved landlord lists, whereas other universities really struggle and student unions really struggle and have different focuses. I think especially universities that have split campuses, so they have to deal with a whole number of different councils and localities, it can be really hard to kind of get that change initiated.
Thanks, Bryony. Maria, do you want to ask your question?
Oh yes, hello, thank you. Yeah, it's Maria Kelly. I'm from Homes in Sedgemoor. Actually, I'm in the very fortunate situation of having my son just move into a property in Cardiff this year. And one of the things that's really shocked me as I've gone in there to see is the age of the boiler. I mean, it's ancient, and I've, fortunately, being in this position, I've been able to sort out his energy tariff, etc. But the information I got from the old tenants of that property was that the gas consumption each year was in excess of 26,000 kilowatts per hour, which is an awful lot. My initial question really was to find out if there is anything within universities, within the halls of residence, within student letting agents to direct them, point them in the direction of help to set themselves up when they move into a property. I know you did just sort of touch on it towards the end, Jade, but also what action can they take if they do think there are horrendous flaws in the sort of structure of the property, the boiler and that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, firstly, I don't think it surprises me that there's some really inefficient heating systems out there. And I feel for students so much when you see these problems that they encounter. And there can be such differences between landlords. So we know that some landlords will do, especially where all-inclusive bills are concerned as well, they will control their heating through now the Hive remote control support. Yeah. Students don't have any control over when their heating comes on or how warm it is. And I think, in short, like, I don't know how much action they can take. And that's the thing that I find incredibly difficult, is that when you have scenarios like that, it's almost like putting a bit of a sticking plaster over it. So I can tell students to draft proof their homes, to program their heating, and then students come back to me and say, we've done all of that and our bills are still huge and we don't know what to do. And I don't know what to say to them, because what can they do? You know, we know that they talk to their landlords and that often doesn't have an impact. They can talk to their universities, and you know, often student unions and universities will then take those landlords off approved approved landlord lists. Some students have taken some of it into their own hands, and they've created landlord rating schemes, so that if you have a terrible experience, you can then put that on the rating scheme, so that there's some ability for students to then be able to go and see if their landlord has been rated in the past. But I think in many cases, you know, they know, landlords know that they can then rent that property out again next year. So it's almost as like the problem then just passes on to somebody else. And I think, you know, we were hopeful with things like the minimum energy efficiency standard that might improve the situation, that if all properties are going to have to improve their efficiency. But the reality is it just seems that there's no way to really enforce landlords to do much about that. I may be wrong, but that's the feeling that we've got. So it does leave students in a really vulnerable situation where there's very few actions they can take.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Maria.
Great. Alice, could I just add something to that? Sorry.
Yes, of course, yeah.
All right. I'm Joanna Seymour. I'm a project manager for Warm Wales. I'm also an environmental health officer with 16 years experience working in the private rented sector. So all the things that you've been saying about dealing with landlords and poor quality accommodation, obviously from a private rented side, if the properties aren't under the approved code of practice of the universities, then if the property doesn't comply, that there are issues wrong, then the local authority environmental health officers do have powers to deal with it. And that's who, you know, as in sort of is needed and who you can go to. Yes, sometimes it's difficult because obviously students then don't want to, you know, as in sort of go through the complaints process and, you know, end up getting notices and all those sort of things. But then also within Wales, you've got Rent Smart Wales. So again, if there are no particular codes and it is a normal private rented property that the landlord is renting out to students, especially in Cardiff, then the property needs to be registered and the landlord needs to be licensed, or the letting agents. So there are more things that can be done, and it is environmental health that is there to help support students. And I do think there's probably an opportunity there to, you know, look at linking, you know, as in sort of environmental health and, you know, some sort of work that's being done within local authorities and supporting students and the union.
Yeah, and I think that's so good to know. And also I guess it's about trying to find those pathways that will happen, because I think because students live in their properties for a very short period of time, for them they just can't be bothered to make an issue out of it, because they can just move out within the year, and then, like I was saying, it just goes then onto somebody else. So definitely, I think for me, taking on that feedback in terms of the things that I can then report back to students is like, do follow it up. Like, if you have a problem, you may be able to leave soon, but, you know, look after your fellow student community in making sure that it's flagged. So that's really good to know.
Yeah, I agree there, and I think raising awareness is probably a good starting point in terms of telling students what services are out there for them to help whilst they're living independently, probably for the first time as well. We've got a good question, come from Matthew Scott at NEA, who talks about fuel poverty and education policy agendas. They don't really talk to each other very much, and he was wondering if you have any indication of whether there's been interest from government, BEIS or Department of Education, or even elsewhere in energy poverty at universities. Is this on a radar anywhere? Do you know?
If it is, it's definitely not been passed to me. So yeah, it's nothing. We've never had interest in terms of doing things with students in energy poverty from policymakers or anything higher. It's always been down to universities to fund our work, or we do lots of kind of funding bids and charitable bids as well. So that's, at the moment, that's been the only way that we've been able to get funding for our work.
Yeah.
If there is any opportunities to do more things, we would love to do it. Like, we feel very constricted on how much we can do. We'd love to do more.
Yeah, I think it'd be a really good insight, especially when universities focus so much on attainment numbers and their sources of funding. So I think if you put the link together and make it clear, hopefully that would be a good, strong campaign.
Yeah.
There's me saying as though I'll take that one on myself. Let's have a look. Okay, we've got two more questions. So from Ed Hodson, you can either come forward or I can ask you a question, Ed. Okay, do you think universities would be willing to work with local organisations such as Citizens Advice to promote knowledge around energy use and saving money on bills?
Yes, I'd say so. I think probably most of that knowledge would come through maybe student unions. I think the key, and Alice, I know you've worked within a student union, so you know the issues there, is that there's so many good topics to be working on. If you unpicked all of the kind of the issues of justice and working on campaigns that are important to students, there's just too many for a student union to be focusing on. So definitely trying to grab the student unions attention and making it easy for a union to do something. So many offices will not have the time to be able to sit down and create those accommodation guides. So having things like that ready for them and just being able to offer them out to unions and also university departments who also have lots of things to be doing, I think are really key. So that's something that we are definitely thinking about, can we pull some information together, or is there things already out there that can easily then just kind of be giving out to student unions and universities. So NUS has kind of started doing a little bit on this. They've got a ready to rent webpage that has some links and information and guides on it, but I think it definitely could be have more information in there for you.
Yeah, I agree, and I think we always talk about the tens of thousands of students at each university, and that there will be certain vulnerable groups who are especially harder to reach, and I think student unions have always had that problem, and this is just one example of an area which could help quite a lot of people, but again, like we say, just in that category of hard to reach and facing a barrier. Okay, what's the time? We'll do one last question. Does anybody want to ask their question to Jade verbally? No, they must enjoy the sound of my voice. So let's have a look at... Is there any work being done with trading standards, environmental health? I guess obviously we spoke to Joanna earlier, but specifically with NUS, with trading standards departments, and looking at EPC ratings, can there be more work done here, or what's already going on?
Yeah, so I guess that many student unions will be doing things within their trading standards and their local councils. So I do think there's probably a lot more going on than I realise and I'm aware of. In terms of EPCs, so this is something that we've been trying to promote through our Students for Trust Plus campaign. And we've also been doing, I think we've got 3 years of research now in terms of students' awareness on their EPCs. The thing that we've generally found is that through our work, awareness of EPCs is increased. So more students are looking at their EPCs and aware that it exists, but actually taking that into consideration when renting a property hasn't changed that much. So whilst they may be more aware to look at how efficient the property is, without a doubt, the cost of the rent still outweighs almost everything for them. And I just can't quite get that barrier down of just really making it clear that whilst cost of rent is so important, how much the impact of an inefficient property can have, both on finances, but also health and well-being as well.
Great, thank you. I think I've got a personal question, but it's also been asked in here, is and you may have mentioned working with energy suppliers. Do you think there's any or more room for NUS to personally work with energy suppliers to ensure that they're doing the best they can for students, especially when it comes to bills or even understanding their energy use within the home?
Yeah, and I think it's one of those areas that at the moment that isn't a natural link to make. So NUS working with a supplier, there's a whole host of kind of things to jump over for that, and I don't think that's ever been an obvious partnership. Yeah. I mean, it would be great if there could be work done on making energy suppliers and tariffs and bills more affordable and more accessible to students. I don't know if that's, people think that that's a possibility that will happen. Whether that's a good use of time or whether it wouldn't ever come to it, I'm not sure. It'd be really good to get anyone's thoughts on that in emails afterwards.
I agree. I think there's a link there that should happen. I remember, this is just my story, my first year of uni, living in a home, very high ceilings, quite an old property, and we'd all put our electric heaters in the front room and watch TV with 4 electric heaters on, blankets and dressing gowns, and I just thought that was how we lived. But no, we just didn't understand our bills and why we were paying so much. And I think even just having the awareness of where the help is makes a start, but also energy suppliers to be able to help as well with that when students are new into the property would be useful. Okay, we'll wrap things up unless anybody has any final comments or questions. Please shout up now. No, and no one's got their hand up. Okay, well, thank you very much, Jade, for giving us your time today. And thank you everyone for joining us for our conversation with NUS. If you have any questions, please do let myself or Jade know, and we can make the slides available, but the recording will be on YouTube and I think a link on our website as well. So thank you very much, and we hope that you've enjoyed our Warm Homes Week this year. Thanks again for joining us.